This is chapter 5 of the Bubble Bath Paradox by Steve Parker. Yankee Doodle Dandy. The stars of the after-event shindig were Donald Trump and his wife Tiffany. These were their stage names, the names the world was most familiar with for them. They had changed their names to be the same as one of the last elected presidents of the former United States of America and one of his daughters. I think I remember that their original names, according to the archives, were John and Jane Doe or something similar, but I would have to look that up to be sure. They said they had changed their names to honor the past president, and this was undoubtedly true to some degree. But they had also been changing their names for years by the time of the consecration ceremony. Doing so, again according to the archives, to stay one step ahead of prosecution for a variety of crimes. Their history also had them changing their names at least 2 times in the 5 or so years they lived after the consecration ceremony, the ceremony being the point in time when they were transported into the future, to now. I suppose, decades ago, before biometrics was so ubiquitous, changing one's name might have worked as a way of avoiding the law, but they had chosen the names of relatively famous people each time, so I don't see how that would help them avoid unwanted attention. The history I had read of the cult said that they had been Ronald Reagan and Hillary Clinton, Ike and Julie Eisenhower, Dick and Tricia Nixon, and several others I can almost remember. They chose somewhat important figures from history, and they creatively paired them off. So I felt like I almost remembered all of the names, even when I read them for the first time. Pairing a president of a failed state with his daughter, as was the case with Donald and Tiffany Trump, sounded pretty creepy to me. They were creepier times overall, but apparently the Trump fellow was pretty creepy even for back then. I'm fairly sure they used the names Dick and Tricia Nixon at some point after the consecration ceremony. With them existing in history after they were transported to now, it could be that some event occurs in my future that resets their past. Would I be doing something in the future that would reset the past so I would then end up doing the thing in the now recent past that brought these two cultists into the future like I just did? This felt like a sure way of getting quite dizzy again, and I was still hoping to get some pasta and hold it down. Though, despite the risk of nausea, I instinctively wanted to grasp onto the idea that this time travel thing might be reversible and somehow make reversing it real. Repairing a broken reality is a strong motivator on all sorts of levels. Could I just set up a simple reverse of my experiment? Send everything back like it did not happen? What would it take? Would I need to rebuild the chapel and then redo the experimental setup? I knew that I didn't have enough in my budget for even simple restoration, like fixing cosmetic blemishes on wallboard. There was no way I could restore a whole building, let alone replacing all the lost equipment from the setup. There was also the fact that I had little idea how the time sampling experiments even worked. I would not be the person coming up with any reverse time sampling setup that would save the world. It was also becoming obvious to me that I would not ever be doing any time sampling experiments ever again. I was actively trying to ignore that possibility. I might actually be stuck in a limbo where I was unable to do any research on anything. Who would want to hire someone who accidentally destroyed reality? This situation was bad. My career was probably as dead as many of the amputation victims left behind in the past by the event. It was best not to think about my career at all. Don and Tiff were the leaders of the cult who oversaw the donation of the cross to the university. Their signatures are on the paperwork, and they choreographed the consecration ceremony. They have, or perhaps had, been dead for about 40 years, having died just a few years after the consecration ceremony. Now they were alive, and once they got over their shock and the weapons were put away, they took to the media like fish to water. They were smiling and praising Jesus and talking up a storm, an attention storm. These were, as far as anyone knew, actual time travelers. They were inherently interesting, and the world naturally turns its attention to them. They were also very good at cultivating attention. The videos of them engaging the media are amazing. It was like the complex mating dance of a tropical species of brightly colored insect. Things had changed a lot since the time they had been taken from, and it took them quite a while to catch on. One of the dances they were incredibly graceful at involved appearing that they completely understood things about which they hadn't a clue, and this future they were now in had a lot of such things. The press pointed all sorts of gadgets at them whose technology wasn't dreamed of where they had come from. The tiny town of temporary buildings must have looked like nothing they could have imagined. The silent aerial vehicles coming and going amazed me, and I had seen things like them before. It must have floored them. In the midst of all this, the Trumps acted like it was just another day in the park, completely unflustered. Everybody looked unflustered compared to me. I was coated in vomit and dust from a collapsing building and also quite unsteady on my feet. The Trumps smiled for the cameras once they realized where they were. Big, flashy grins that yelled, "Everything is perfect." During this initial interface with the press, the Trumps kept on trying to introduce words and phrases the press folks did not understand. Words like gays and blacks and illegals and welfare queen. It was a long list, and the press folks just ignored what they did not understand, but they would look up the terms later. I had already looked up some of the Trump terms to better understand the consecration ceremony. You can look them up too, but their importance is not obvious. These are the names of groups of people. Groups is a bad name for them, as it implies people join these groups. These are ways of grouping people based on intrinsic qualities that people have. The term blacks, for instance, basically refers to those who are born with more melanin than others. This was, of course, a term used long before dynamic melanin body art. The Trumps did get a little flustered at the dynamic melanin body art. They did skip a few beats before getting back on track the first time they saw an advertisement crawl across the forehead of a journalist who was asking them a question. I have a little body art patch on my thigh. I reprogrammed it a few weeks ago, never to form Carol's name again. The reason the grouping names were important to the Trumps is that people used to use groupings to identify people to hate. I know this is confusing. The cult even went so far as to blame certain groups for incurring their god's wrath and causing natural disasters like earthquakes and hurricanes. I realize this is now sounding confusing and stupid, and, as far as I can tell, it is. In the coming days, the media people looked up all the offhand terms the Trumps were throwing around and, as a result, got a little sour on the Trumps. Soon the media streams were replaying clips of the Trumps repeatedly invoking something called Jesus, and then trying to explain what Jesus was and why they were invoking it. Many of the press had picked up a little background on what the cross was. They had been informed of its possible importance for the event. To them, as it was to essentially everyone, the idea of a primitive torture device was horrifying. The fact that the Trumps were wearing replicas of the torture device around their necks, on their clothing, and in their ears was not easily reconciled with what the press had discovered the cross was. The conversations about Jesus were asymmetric. The Trumps would invoke Jesus or something like Jesus' name or the love of Jesus and would be asked what Jesus was and why it was important. The Trumps should have gotten a hint that they were sailing uncharted waters when, after they replied with something like, Jesus died for your sins, they were met with questions like, what is a sin and how does dying for a sin work? Then, when the Trumps mentioned that Jesus died for these mysterious sins by being tortured to death on the cross, something a journalist thought they knew a little bit about, they were hit with questions like, don't you think torture is a bit harsh? And why couldn't Jesus die of old age for everyone's sins? At one point, Donald mentioned that one of the Romans stuck a spear in Jesus' side to help him die faster, and this only raised all sorts of new questions. Does that make it better for you? Or how much agony was needed in this sin-dying thing, and did Jesus produce excess agony, and was that used for anything? Or what was his sin stuff again, and is it still available? The Trumps looked more and more like torture-worshipping hate-mongers as the press paid more attention to them. This was exactly the impression I got of them when I researched them in the archives. Actually, researching the archives added quite a number of additional deplorable qualities that were not obvious on simple inspection. They were larcenous, creepy, lying, parasitic criminals, as well as being simple torture-worshipping hate-mongers everyone could see in the after-event videos. The interest in the time travelers would eventually result in a plethora of stories about the history of the Trumps and their cult. Some focused on the shady methods the Trumps had employed in amassing an enormous amount of wealth for the cult. They claimed their God had blessed them with 10 trillion US dollars at a time when the gross national product of the old USA was less than 20 trillion in that same currency. Staggering amounts of money. Though the $10 trillion number may have been a lie. The gems and the cross alone were supposed to be worth almost $1 trillion US dollars before they were devalued to a few hundred by the availability of synthetic replacements. Though many of the gems may have been fake and so worth even less than a few hundred at the time. The 1,000 kilos of gold and platinum in the cross should still be worth a huge amount. That is, if there was that much precious metal in the cross. Most now believed it was mostly lead. I had watched the 5 hours of the consecration ceremony footage twice while aligning the sample targeting control parameters. Then I watched the 20 minutes or so of the target time period I'd narrowed down to, maybe a couple dozen more times. I was tired of seeing their faces long before I'd finished creating the control parameter batch files. I would, along with every other person on the planet, be bombarded with a fire hose of Trump facts and images for the next, well, it's still going on, isn't it? There was a Trump fact that was uncovered that was really quite interesting. An analysis of their DNA showed that they had one living relative. My flatmate Paul was related to Donald as, unbeknownst to Paul, his father was born to a surrogate mother using Don's sperm several years before the consecration ceremony. Sitting on the steps and looking down at the undulating chaos that was the emergency response to the event, had little time to align what I knew with what I had just seen. I had been remembering a scene from the archival footage that occurred just before the first sampling. Don and Tiff were standing to either side of the cross, and a throng of followers had stacked the pews. I remember those strange bowls now. I had even asked a historian about them. They were collection plates. After they were blessed by Don, the cultists would pass them around and ask everyone to put money in them. I don't know how they could ever collect any amount that would compare to just interest on the cult's supposed wealth, but the collection of pocket money was an important part of the ritual. While the collection plates were being blessed, the cultists knelt in a half circle, with the cross and Don and Tiff at the center. Many of the faces of the kneeling cultists were pointed upwards as if there was something particularly interesting near the ceiling of the chapel. If the border of the spherical anomaly was about a half a meter, give or take, smaller than the radius of the circle the cultists knelt in, well, it would cut all their arms off and maybe a few faces. The collection plate blessing occurred a few minutes before I had the first sampling targeted, since there were no lips touching the apex jewel of the cross until the consecration ceremony proper. There was no sampling at all scheduled until after the money collection. I targeted the lips, and relative to the lips, the brain, so if there were no lips on the jewel, then I would not have been taking a sample. I ran that possibility over in my head a few times. The words, "not my fault," burned brightly in my mind, since I was not sampling yet when the event occurred near the target time period. This was more than simply comforting. It was an exculpatory explanation. I smiled tentatively until Tim Gross, the dean of the College of Natural Sciences, appeared and walked up to me. Tim scrunched his nose at the vomit on my shirt. "Bob?" Until that moment, I assumed Tim did not know my name, as he had never used it. "Not my fault," I tried to say. I'm not sure how it came out, though. Tim looked at me as if I was talking gibberish. "Bob, you look like crap. It is cold out here. Why don't you come down to the ICC and get cleaned up and a cup of coffee? If you're up for lunch, we have some pasta that's almost ready." "Nobody is trying to blame anyone for this," said Tim. He went so far as if to put his hand on my shoulder, but thought better of it. "Here, follow me." The small clutch of people that had been herding me from the chapel steps all smiled and nodded to Tim's suggestion. I felt like smiling and nodding too. The Incident Command Center, ICC, was a large rectangular box on short legs. I'm not sure if it had walked here on the legs or if they had simply been deployed after it was set in place. It was about 4 meters wide, 3 meters tall, and 20 meters long. When I got closer, I thought that it was actually made of what looked like 4 sections that fit together. It looked like they were attaching a 5th segment on the north end. The smell of pasta was definitely coming from somewhere in or near the ICC. The ICC was being set up in the shadow of one of the huge tent/shipping container temporary structures. The mall was much more crowded when seen from down amongst these freshly constructed buildings. There were steps and a door in section 2, and when the door opened, I felt a gentle blast of sanitary warmth hit me, and I realized how cold I'd gotten while sitting on the museum steps. Tim said something to one of the uniformed people inside, and they went to a cupboard mounted flush against the far wall, and then handed me a package they pulled from it. "Put that on. You will feel better in fresh clothes, and we will all like it if you did not smell so bad." He pointed to a door behind me that led to Module 1. "Go shower and change in there. It is the emergency shower. Just don't hit the decon button." I nodded, smiled, and went into the shower room. I shut the door behind me, and it was suddenly quiet. I was no longer cold, but I was trembling. The room was mirrored, probably so that you could see all the stuff you were decontaminating off yourself. There was a door opposite to the outside, and, about mid-room, a post with a control tile on it. I was a mess. I was covered in white dust. My hair was white. I had rubbed most of the white off my eyes when I was sobbing, and it looked like I was wearing a pink mask. My clothing was white, except where I had thrown up on myself. I had been wearing a bright red shirt that was now white, except for where the vomit had rinsed some of the chapel dust off. I would have looked like I had thrown up blood if I bled in muted pastel pink. I took off my clothes, and I still looked white. I was pale and blotchy and pathetic looking. I wanted to cry again, but thought better of it. The control tile lit up when I tapped it, and the commands appeared fairly straightforward. I tapped hot water shower with soap, and it told me to shut my eyes till the notification sounded. The water that hit me from all sides was so warm and comforting, I almost melted. After about 10 seconds, a ding sounded and I opened my eyes. The room was steamy, but it was brightly lit. I decided this was because the mirrors were no fogging. Good, I thought. My mind is still working. The shower lasted another minute or two, but I found hot water shower on the control tile and luxuriated in another 5 minutes of shower just because I could. I think it was the best 5 minutes of my life. I was going to take a third shower, but the best was behind me now, and now it was time to face reality again, at least what was left of it. I found dry on the control tile, and the room was filled with warm air and diffuse red light. After a few more minutes, I was dry, and then the control tile let out another ding. Put a fork in me, I'm done, I told myself. I opened the plastic parcel and pulled out clothing made out of some foam material that had all the air compressed out of it. As I held it, the clothing sucked up air like a sponge and expanded to several times its size. A gray shirt, jacket, some underwear, socks, and trousers, and also some surprisingly comfortable shoes. They were very warm, and I left the jacket unzipped. The university's logo and the words University Emergency Response Services was written all over the clothing. It took me a minute to read it in the mirror. Deciphering it was yet more proof that my brain was working. Unfortunately, that confirmation of sanity also felt like proof that what had happened in the museum actually did happen. For some reason, part of my subconscious still thought I could avoid that realization. I picked my now wet clothing up from the pile I had left it as and stuffed them into the plastic bag the emergency clothing parcel had come in. I thought about wringing the water from them first, and then just didn't. I stared at the door for a second and thrust my hands into the pockets of the jacket with determination. There was something in one of the pockets. I pulled out a slightly stiffer wad of the same material the jacket was made of, and it started to expand into a large hat with a large floppy brim. I looked at myself in the mirrored walls and stuffed the hat onto my head. It looked limp. I took it off and began playing with the brim to make it look better. I eventually folded up 3 sides to make it stay put. I stuffed it back on my head and I thought it looked better, like a 17th century pirate's tricorn hat. If I had a parrot on my shoulder, I would have looked just like a pirate. A pasty, worn-out, half-dead, but freshly showered, clean pirate. I put my chin into the air and opened the door to the rest of the ICC. There was a flood of sound. I don't know how I had missed all the monitors and crowds of people. So many lights and sounds and people had blinked my eyes. My roommate Paul was there, and he was saying something. He saw me blinking my eyes at him blankly and repeated what he was saying, only louder. "Hey, Paul Revere," he said, pointing at my hat. "Long enough shower there, Yankee Doodle." I might have felt self-conscious if it was anyone else making fun of my hat, but it was Paul. The world had ended, and then Paul showed up to make fun of my new hat. Some order, at least, had been restored to the universe. You have been listening to Chapter 5 of the Bubble Bath Paradox, written and read by Steve Parker, with music by the phenomenal Victor McSurley.